Welcome to today's event. I am Linda Bathgate, the Assistant Director and Editor-in-Chief at Washington State University Press. As we get started, I would like to acknowledge that the Washington State University Pullman campus is located on the homelands of the Nimiipuu tribe, also known as the Nez Perce and the Palas peoples. We acknowledge their presence here since time immemorial and recognize their continuing connection to the land, to the water, and to their ancestors. WSU Press is committed to publishing works that foster a deeper understanding of the Pacific Northwest and the contributions of its native peoples. This event is entitled New Perspectives on Captain Cook and the Lewis and Clark Expedition, and will feature a conversation and Q&A session with David Nicandri, highlighting his two new books on explorers in the Pacific Northwest. Captain Cook Rediscovered, Voyaging to the Icy Latitudes, published by University of British Columbia Press in November 2020. And Lewis and Clark Reframed, Examining Ties to Cook, Vancouver, and Mackenzie, published by Washington State University Press in December 2020. This event is being recorded and it will be available to view via the WSU Press and the UBC Press YouTube channels. The link for closed captioning on YouTube is posted in the chat bar. If you have questions for Dave or for our interviewer tonight, Clay Jenkinson, please post them in the YouTube chat bar. I will pose them to Dave and Clay during the Q&A segment after the conversation. This presentation is a collaboration between the presses at University of British Columbia and Washington State University. We are extremely grateful for the help from And Books 2, an independent bookstore in Clarkston, Washington, the Cowlitz County Historical Museum in Kelso, Washington, and the International Captain Cook Society. If you are here watching, it's likely due to the outstanding promotional efforts of these co-sponsors. To order books, please use the links to the press websites that we are posting in the YouTube chat bar. We will also display this information at the end of the session. Where possible and safe to do so, we encourage you to visit your local bookstore. Now, I am pleased to introduce Dave Nicandri. Dave has spent most of his life working to preserve and promote the history of the Pacific Northwest. After receiving his master's degree in history from the University of Idaho, he began work as a historian at the Washington State Capitol Museum in 1972. In 1987, he became director of the Washington State Historical Society. He served in that role for 24 years until his retirement in 2011. During that tenure, he was also executive editor of Columbia, the magazine of Northwest history, published by the Society. Among his previously published books are River of Promise, Lewis and Clark on the Columbia, and the edited volume Arctic Ambitions, Captain Cook and the Northwest Passage, which he co-edited with James Barnett. He was awarded the Charles Gates Memorial Award in 2004, and he received the Robert Gray Medal from Washington State Historical Society in 2011. He holds honorary degrees from Gonzaga University, the University of Puget Sound, and the University of Idaho. He currently serves on the Board of Trustees for the Evergreen State College in Olympia. I would like to thank Dave for joining us tonight and sharing his vast knowledge with us. And I now hand the microphone over to Joseph Kovetnik at the Cowlitz County Historical Museum.
Good evening, everybody. I'm Joseph Kovetnik, the director of the Cowlitz County Historical Museum. It is a pleasure to partner with UBC Press and WSU Press in promoting this program. David Nicandri has presented on numerous occasions here at the Cowlitz County Historical Museum during the tenure of our previous director, David Freese. So it is a pleasure to participate in another one of David's programs again. Lewis and Clark are relevant to our regional history here in the Lower Columbia region, of which Cowlitz County exists. We know many of our members will be very excited about this topic. Our museum is open Tuesdays through Saturdays from 10 o'clock to 4 o'clock p.m. and admission is free. I thank you for your interest, and I'm going to turn the floor over now to Clay Jenkinson, who will be moderating this discussion, and he is the former director of the Dakota Institute and co-host of Public Radio's Thomas Jefferson Hour. Thank you.
Thanks to you, Joseph. Thanks to you, Linda, and thanks to WSU Press for hosting this event. I'm delighted to be here. And to all of you who are watching around the country or around the world, we welcome your questions. Put them on the YouTube chat, and Linda will bring them to our attention later on in this conversation. David Nicandri, my old dear friend, first of all, congratulations. These 2 books in a single year, Captain Cook Rediscovered, Voyaging to the Icy Latitudes, University of British Columbia Press, and from Washington State University Press, Lewis and Clark Reframed, Examining Ties to Cook, Vancouver, and Mackenzie. What a extraordinary achievement that is. And let me say to all those who are listening or watching this elsewhere, that when you published your book, River of Promise, Lewis and Clark on the Columbia, the greatest of all Lewis and Clark scholars, James Rhonda, in an interview with me, said that it was, in his mind, as important a book as was written during the bicentennial of the Lewis and Clark expedition. Very, very high praise indeed. And I was thrilled to play a small role in all that. I want to start with an easy question, and that is about you as a writer. You know, Theodore Roosevelt gave an address to the American History Association in 1912. And he said, the problem is that scholars tend to be bad writers and good writers tend to be bad scholars. You've shown that's not true. One of the things I most admire about your work is the quality of your English prose. I'm just going to read one sentence here from your book on James Cook. You say, Cook had long since moved past a pointillist delineation of the Pacific's 12,933 habitable islands in favor of depicting the globe on a grand continental and oceanic scale. This outlook was the hegemonic impulse driving British interest in the Northwest Passage and any related commercial opportunities that could be derived from it. That's beautiful writing. So pointillist, my goodness, that's a phrase you would not expect in a book about the great James Cook. Tell us a little bit about how you developed your inimitable prose style. What shaped you as a writer, not as a historian, but as a writer?
Well, thank you, Clay. And let me also extend my thanks to all the hosts and sponsors of tonight's conversation. I think that the simplest answer and quickest, Clay, is that I've admired other people's writings, including yours, I must add. So I'm kind of a student of words. I pay attention to them. When I come upon a phrase or a word that I like, I kind of make a note of it. And sometimes when you're just looking for an economy of phraseology, a word that seems to suggest itself comes to mind. Pointillist, of course, is an art historical term that refers to artists who put real tiny dots to frame a larger image. And so the context of that particular observation is that one of the great criticisms of Captain Cook is that during his 3rd voyage, he chose not to explore islands that on his 2 previous voyages he might have. And the larger point of the sentence is he had gotten tired of pointillism because there was, if you will, no point to it because it was an endless catalog. He had moved on to a continental scale, which is why Terra Australis appealed to him. It's why North America appealed to him, and the Northwest Passage as a way through or around it. So I had good teachers. I'm a parochial school graduate. The nuns, we diagrammed sentences endlessly. We did the catechism, so there was probably some Latinate expressionism in there as well. So I like to read. I had good teachers, and just look for an opportunity to apply good language.
Well, and it works, of course. Just quickly to follow up on that, Dave, on the 3rd voyage, which is your main focus in the book on James Cook, He had the chance, for example, to explore Fiji and did not. And some historians have said this shows that he'd run out of steam, that he was tired, that earlier in the first two voyages he would never have allowed something like Fiji to go uncircumvented and unmapped. And then later, when he, of course, for those of who are watching in the Columbia River Valley, when he came near the mouth of the Great Columbia, he made no attempt to explore it. And you have an answer to that. So what is your answer?
Cook was, among his great skills and capabilities, he had an exceptional commitment to mission, fidelity to mission. For his second and third voyages, he had a strong hand in writing his own instructions, which is nice work if you can get it, something Meriwether Lewis didn't have advantage of. So in the case of the third voyage, there, other than the Kerguelen Islands, which are in the Indian Ocean, not the Pacific, there was no Southern Hemisphere objective for him in the Southern Hemisphere other than delivering a Polynesian emigre, Mai, who had been taken to England at the end of the second voyage by Cook's adjutant, commander of the second voyage. So other than dropping off Mai and reprovisioning his mission, he had no work to do in the Southern Pacific. So as I say in the book, historians, and John C. Beagle holds the one who seeded this critique of the tired Voyager hypothesis, as I called it. Cook had no mission in the South Pacific. And going back to the pointillism argument, at the end of his second voyage, he said he was done with the South Pacific. It's as if no historian has ever paid attention to what Cook's own impression of the Southern Hemisphere was, or the South Pacific in particular. He had moved beyond the South Pacific. Of course, in Cook historiography, that's heresy, because again, the palm tree paradigm dictates that it's all about the South Pacific. And of course, that's what's different and novel about my interpretation.
Let me just go back to the mouth of the Columbia for a moment. You argue that his instructions were, don't start looking for the western portal to the Northwest Passage until you get to 65 north latitude. And so when he went by the Columbia, it was far too soon for him to be looking inward.
Correct. So the Columbia River and the Strait of Juan de Fuca are the Northern Hemisphere, North American analog to Fiji and Samoa earlier in the voyage. Again, the historians of the region, and now in this case, it's historians of the Pacific Northwest, want Cook to run the expedition they would have run. But because a fellow by the name of Samuel Hearn, a Hudson Bay trader, who had gone diagonal northwest from Hudson Bay to what he thought was 72 degrees north, encountered no openings, encountered no natives who knew of any water to the west other than the Arctic Ocean, which he met, nor did they, and in fact, contrary to any openings, the Indians Hearn met told him there's a big range of mountains off to the west. So when Cook's instructions were being written in 1775, every knowledgeable geographer knew that if the goal was to find a passage, saltwater passage from the Pacific to the Atlantic, there was no point in looking for one until you got at least as far north as Hearn had been. Now, Hearn thought he had been to 72. It was actually only 68 degrees north. But there was no point at looking at for an inlet at 46 north or 48 north in the case of the Columbia or the Strait of Juan de Fuca. So Cook just went right on by until he and began to actually fulfill the mission of the third voyage when he got really, he began to, you could see the pace in his journal pick up. He's more astute. He's making more cartographic references when he gets to about where modern Sitka is. And he comes into, he sees the mountains that Vitus Bering saw. When he's in Bering's country, he knows he's close. And that's really almost 2 years after it commenced. Cook's third voyage, the discovery zone of the third voyage, was finally reached.
And as you know, we'll get to Lewis and Clark before we're done with this conversation. Something similar happens in the journals of Meriwether Lewis, that for the first year from St. Charles, Missouri until the Mandan villages in today's North Dakota, he's not only not usually writing, but he's more or less 100% silent. This is a perplexity in Lewis and Clark studies. Why would Lewis, the commander of this important expedition, Thomas Jefferson's protege, why an Enlightenment exemplar, why would he be silent for the entire first year? And the answer may be, as with Cook, he hadn't yet reached the takeoff point for the true discovery phase of his expedition.
Yes, but there's a more particular example, and that would be Alexander Mackenzie. Cook has influences on Lewis, to be sure, but Alexander Mackenzie has even more influence over Lewis than Cook, because after all, Mackenzie's doing a terrestrial cross-continental exploration, and that's what Lewis is up to. Jefferson responds by putting Lewis in the field because of Mackenzie's book, Voyages from Montreal. So Mackenzie's journal, or his account, his published account, 1801, Voyages from Montreal. There's some prefatory material, but the narrative doesn't really begin until he leaves Fort Chipewyan, which is northwest by a considerable margin from Edmonton. So Lewis's analog to Fort Chipewyan is Fort Mandan, because that's where the real discovery work begins. And although I think that's part of the reason why Lewis doesn't say anything going up the Missouri, the other reason is, much like Mackenzie didn't write about his passage from Montreal to Fort William on Lake Superior to Lake Athabasca, is dozens of people had already been over that terrain. There's no discovery narrative to write about that stretch. So the point of Lewis and Clark reframed is that, again, because I like analogy, the lower Columbia River, Cowlitz County included, is analogous to that stretch of the Missouri from St. Louis to Bismarck, and that is because Cook had been offshore, but Vancouver, at least someone under his command, had been all the way up to modern day Vancouver. And of course, Mackenzie had made it all the way to Tidewater. So I think Lewis, when he gets into the Columbia Basin, much like the lower Missouri, realizes he's in previously explored territory, and so therefore it's not as important for him to be writing.
But this is a central feature of your scholarship, that looking at any of these great journeys in isolation is precisely the wrong way to look at them, by analogizing, by seeing how does Lewis relate to Mackenzie or to Vancouver or to Cook? When does someone write a journal and when does someone not bother? These clues that come from comparative analysis of the history of American or 18th century exploration actually bring us insights that are not available in any other way. Isn't that your methodology?
Absolutely. So for example, on Cook's third voyage, both his second and his third voyage, he gets to the South Pacific by way of the Indian Ocean. The first voyage, he went around Cape Horn, tip of South America, and went west into the Pacific. The second voyage, he went through the Indian Ocean looking for Terra Australis Incognita, didn't find it in the classic form, but gained an intimation that there was a polar continent, what we know of as Antarctica. So the third voyage follows the same path towards New Zealand, his major staging area, on the same route the second voyage did. So Cook, like Lewis, does not keep an extensive journal in the Indian Ocean. He had been there already. Now, when he gets to Kerguelen Island, kind of south of the main tip of India, but many degrees higher and closer to the pole, because that was in his mission, in his instructions from the Admiralty, because he had learned in Cape Town of some French explorers discovering that area, extensive, thorough journal keeping when it's mission related. Otherwise, he says nothing until he gets to the southern tip of Australia and approaches New Zealand again. So mission and a conception of where the discovery zone are or is a key conception for how to understand explorers and what they're up to and when.
And reading the instructions for each of these missions is absolutely essential. Now, let me change the subject just a little bit here. can you in 30 seconds or less tell us what the palm tree paradigm really is?
Yes, I'll do my best. Put me on the clock. um, Captain Cook has been held captive from the very first moment of his published career to the palm tree paradigm, because Tahiti was such an awe-inspiring place that as soon as word of its majesty and the magnetism of its people came to European consciousness, it's literally all people could think about because of its presumed exoticism from a European vantage point. The Tahitians didn't think they were exotic. They thought Cook was the exotic figure. So this was one of the transformative moments in the history of Western civilization. Cook and Bougainville and some other explorers are central to it. So it became, from the very earliest onset of Cook's career, the typical frame of reference for understanding his career. And he had some signature accomplishments in that zone, to be sure, but the tropical zone, to the point, and I know I'm well past 30, the tropical zone was not the point of the second or third voyage. It was the higher latitudes of the southern and northern hemisphere, but the paradigm had been established that sees him as a tropical explorer. And I've tried to bust that apart by looking at him as he truly was, primarily a high latitude, at times polar explorer of the first rank. That's the palm tree paradigm.
I want to challenge it here just for a moment, if I may. So Tahiti, to which he went to observe the transit of Venus, an extremely important moment in the history of the Enlightenment. Thomas Jefferson was involved here. Benjamin Franklin had a role in this. This was a global event. And James Cook was sent there by the British Admiralty to examine this this transit of the planet Venus over the surface of the sun, because it enabled us to learn a whole lot of things, the distance between the Earth to the sun, et cetera, et cetera. And there, of course, he also happens upon this exotic, this erotic, this paradisial world of people. And it has been one of the most enduring myths, or one of the most enduring stories in Western civilization ever since. You know, think of the work of James Michener, for example, part and parcel of this, or Mutiny on the Bounty with its gorgeous pictures of the people of Tahiti and the romances between members of the Bounty and the people of Tahiti and so on.
Or Sigmund Freud.
Exactly. So there's a reason why this is so enduring. It's extremely attractive, and it also represents a challenge to the Western Augustinian view, or the Hobbesian view, that life is nasty, brutish, and short, because it shows a people living in apparent harmony, not shamed into putting fig leaves over their parts, with their sexual generosity of a kind that Europe was unable to approach. And so this was a challenge and corrective to notions that people thought were deeply embedded into the human character. And suddenly, this evidence suggests that there are other ways of organizing life, and some of them might be better.
Yes.
So there's that. And furthermore, it's an encounters story. So I reread your book to prepare for this, and I love your book, but his encounters with native peoples in the North are not as enticing, are not as signifying, as meaningful, in my view, as his encounters in the Polynesian world. And encounters is why we love these stories, because it's not just encounters with environments and with sea ice and so on. It's encounters with the other, and particularly other human beings organizing themselves in different ways. And I just will end the question by quoting from George Gilbert, who was on the third voyage. And Gilbert is 19 years old. And as they leave to go into the far north, Gilbert says, and I quote, "We left these islands with the greatest regret imaginable, as supposing all the pleasures of the voyage to be now at an end, having nothing to expect in future but excessive cold, hunger, and every kind of hardship and distress." Well, I say that to you. I mean, aren't you protesting too much in your palm tree paradigm, which is really an attack on the palm tree paradigm?
What I would, there's nothing you said that I substantially or to any degree disagree with, Clay. That's all true. My point is that none of that analysis, nor do I diminish any of the significance of what you typify. That's all true. The point of the cookbook, if I can call it that, is that historians by choice, anthropologists and ethnologists by necessity, have limited Cook's voyages solely to the encounter. I'm not diminishing the importance of the encounter at all. It's very important, but we don't need I would say one more book about Cook and the encounter. One might almost say there's been too much of that, but I just tried to fill out the picture. Add 20 degrees, 30 degrees below Tahiti, add 30, 40, 50 degrees north of Hawaii, because that is the zone that was actually the point of his second and third voyage. So I don't disagree with the importance of Polynesia and its revolutionary impact on Europe's sense of itself. In fact, I argued in the talk a week ago that the role Cook and people like him and Bougainville played is that, as you put so ably, they demolished Europe's sense of superiority of itself because they could clearly see there were other ways of living. The simplicity of the Aboriginal people of Australia. As I say in the book, there's no more incisive critique of what modern Western materialists to be had in contemporary 21st century discourse than there is to read what James Cook said about Australian Aboriginal people in 1770. That's how far ahead he was of European civilization, or the civilization that sent him into that zone.
All right, so let me get back to Cook, and then we'll move to Lewis here shortly, to Lewis and Clark. But when Cook makes the third voyage and he leaves the Sandwich Islands, he leaves Hawaii and moves into the north, he is carrying a set of maps, but particularly one by German by the name of Jacob von Steulen. And that map is a really interesting map. I wish we could show it, but it has two things that are really important. First of all, it makes Alaska a large island, but infinitely smaller than what we now know as Alaska. But more to the point, on both sides of it, there are wide straits that offer easy access to the far north. So as I understand it, Cook's instructions were to get to the far north and that he would find some way to do that along the western coast of North America. When he gets up there, he discovers that this map is wholly erroneous. In fact, he discovers something that I find shocking when I read your book, which is that it's not a straight north line. Alaska represents a gigantic western detour. To get to the far north, you have to go 1,000 miles west. And so, you know, in the Lewis and Clark studies, there's this moment called the Lem High Disappointment, when Lewis is up on at the Continental Divide near Dillon, Montana, and he sees that there are lots of mountains to the west, and it's not at all going to be an easy transit to the Pacific. And in the mythology of the Lewis and Clark story, this is known as Lem High Disappointment, that Lewis has this kind of sagging view of, oh my gosh, you know, now we're really in trouble. How did Cook respond when he suddenly realized that Alaska wasn't a modest island, it was a subcontinent?
Yes. Cook, in fact, I have a chapter titled The Republic of Letters, which is an important foundational part of that book because it establishes the culture of exploration of theory and Enlightenment era science that Cook thinks he's a member of. He thinks he is in fact a member of the Royal Society, which is the premier learned institution in Great Britain. The premise of empirical science is that through constant iteration and experiment, we have ever increasingly refined and more accurate understanding of things. For example, the distance of the Earth to the sun. very complicated mathematical formula, but with enough experiment, you can answer it. So the premise of Enlightenment era science is that through this iterative process, information is always more accurate and more extensive. Stalin's map completely confounded him because by his own experiment, I mean, Cook proved the dubiousness of Stalin's map by experiment because things just weren't aligned in the way they were on his map or Mueller's or other maps. So Cook was never prepared for the prospect that there would be a retrograde motion in the accuracy of cartographic projection. It was a violation of the premises of the Republic of Letters. In fact, it was such a violation that he went on what can only be described as an extensive rant against Stalin. Basically said, how dare someone put out something as shockingly errant as this cartography is? But of course, we only know it's errant because somebody had to go up there and look. That proved to be James Cook. So I think Cook gets a bad rap along these lines, and maybe to answer a question you haven't asked yet, Clay, because it's been suggested that Cook paid more attention to this errant map or tested it than he did others. And I think that's mistaken. I think I documented in that book that he was very severely critical of the cartography of the eastern coast of Australia and its relationship to New Zealand. And he was highly critical of the presumed cartographic accuracy of the maps of the terrestrial holdings that were presumed to exist in the South Atlantic. So Stalin was no more different than Von Gundy in the South Pacific or Dalrymple in the South Atlantic. It was just an extension of what Cook did, which is demolish cartographic myth.
I just ask all those who are joining us tonight, when the evening is over, to go to your atlas or go to Google Maps and trace the North American West Coast. So you start at Baja and you come to Los Angeles and you come to Monterey and San Francisco and you work your way up to Oregon and the mouth of the Columbia and then to Nook Island and so on. It looks pretty good. You're trending north, slightly west of north. It looks like it's all going to work out. And then suddenly you hit Alaska, which is this mass. I mean, it's an appallingly large mass for a ship in the era of Captain Cook. And to get around it is an almost impossible matter. He had to find his way through a gap in the Aleutians. Then when you finally get through and get above the Bering Strait, now the season is advanced and it's no longer possible to do the thing you were set out to do. So the getting to the entry point of the putative Northwest Passage comes so late in the game that he has to turn back. And of course he dies in Hawaii. But does he ever say, oh my goodness, is Alaska huge?
No, this is the amazing thing about Cook. He was just ineffable. I mean, his power of endurance and his grittiness, I call it in his book. I mean, he just had this yeoman class, this workmanlike devotion to doing a good job, exhausting all the recourses. And it's true, he failed to find the Northwest Passage in the summer of 1778 because in the technical sense, it didn't exist. It does now, at least seasonally, it did not then.
Sort of, yeah.
But even that, he was prepared to return again for an unprecedented fourth year of navigation. And I think one of the least appreciated aspects of Cook's third voyage, and I talk about the absolutely catastrophic effect his death had on his crew. I mean, historians like to, they grumble like Cook's own seamen did about the caliber of the beer that was brewed off of Maui and the north coast of the big island of Hawaii, but they paid relatively little attention to the profound sense of loss his crew felt when he was finally taken from their midst. But notwithstanding that shocking event, he had inculcated a devotion to exploration, fidelity to mission, to such an extent they went north again under Charles Clerk's command, met the same result for the same geographic Cook encountered on the first voyage, but he established a model of exploration rigor, and those who sailed with him learned that lesson well.
In Cook historiography, we all wait for the great moment when he dies in the Sandwich Islands, because it's a sort of extraordinary moment, and of course, with extraordinary consequences. You give us a single paragraph. You cheat us of the great moment. I know that's a reason. I just want to read you a passage from your book. I was shocked that you did this. Obviously, this was part of your strategy, but you say, and very movingly, for half an hour, no one said a word. It was like a dream that we could not reconcile ourselves to for some time. Grief was visible in every countenance. I'm quoting now, some expressing it by tears and others by a kind of gloomy dejection, more easy to be conceived than described. For as all of our hopes centered in him, our loss became irreparable, and the sense of it was so deeply impressed upon our minds as not to be forgot. You chose to give that what would be called historiographical short shrift. Why?
Because it's well known. There's little I can add to it. I think the only thing I credit myself, if I can say it that way, about Cook's end time is that historians have seized upon the fact that his journal ends about 30 days before he's killed.
The lost journal.
Yeah, the law, which evokes the Lewis story, which we'll segue to here quickly. The premise is that the absence of a narrative from Cook dies on February 14th. His journal ends around the 10th or the 14th of January, 30 some days earlier. So the presumption has been, see, this is more evidence that Cook was off his game. Something was amiss. It betrays a very naive understanding of how what we call, Clay, in our own dialogue, the dynamics of journal construction. And what I proved elsewhere in that chapter, Cook tells the story that when he first arrives in Hawaii in January of 1778, there's a very untoward incident. One of his lieutenants, a guy named Williamson, with no cause, it's one of the more egregious incidents of the encounter, shoots a native Hawaiian. In his journal, Cook writes, that happens very early in his stay. Cook writes in his journal, the reflective retrospective account, he said, I learned of this after we left the islands. Well, so that raises the question, well, how long after Williamson shoots this poor guy do they leave the islands? Well, it's about 15 or 20 days. And not only that, one sees that Cook isn't writing his journal every day after they leave the island. So I gave the example in the case of the Williamson massacre, if I can call it that. Cook does not record that in all likelihood until 30 days after it occurred, because he's writing retrospectively. Thus, it was not, people ascribe some exceptionality to this gap when it's simply a matter of the fact Cook didn't live long enough to fill out the 30 days between the 10th or 13th of January and the 14th of February. So understanding the dynamics of the journals is vital to a true appreciation of Cook, and equally, if not more so, our man Lewis.
Absolutely. So I'm going to move to Lewis now, just to say this one more thing. The fact that Cook was willing to go back after his imperfect approach to the high north in the third year, and spend the winter in the Sandwich Islands, and then go all that way back up to the Bering Straits, shows that he was not tired. Whatever else is true of Captain Cook, this is not a person who's aching to get home. He's going to extend this by another full year.
In fact, I argue in the book that if Cook's voyage along the Arctic ice edge, following the walruses as his fog beacons, that was the boldest, bravest, most ambitious navigation of his career. And it was a mere 4 or 5 months before his death. So there was the tired voyager hypothesis is a myth. I like to think that that's one of the things I've relegated to the dustbin of history with this book.
Well, if we had more time, I would quibble a little bit with you. I think I would bring it just back a little. I think he's more like Rod Carew in the late years. He still got it when he needs it, but he doesn't have it every single day. But anyway, let's move on. So on April 7th, 1805, at Fort Mandan in North Dakota, Meriwether Lewis writes one of the most famous journal entries of his entire career. And he says, among other things, this little fleet, although perhaps not quite so respectable as those of Columbus or Captain Cook, were still viewed by us with as much pleasure as those deservedly famed adventurers ever beheld theirs, and I dare say with as much anxiety for their safety and preservation. Pretty big claim for Meriwether Lewis to put himself in the same sentence with the two greatest explorers of history, at least modern history, Christopher Columbus, who gets an automatic mention, and then the greatest man of the 18th century for exploration, James Cook. You know, you don't need Lloyd Benson of Texas to say, you're no Captain Cook. What do you make?
Well, there's a lot going on there. First of all, it harkens back to the point we made however many minutes ago about when the discovery phase of the voyage begins. This is a marker, again, in terms of understanding the dynamics of the journal. I argue in both of these books that the names an explorer associates with his own venture, that's the key to when the explorer thinks something big is happening. That explains, I mean, Lewis doesn't name a river after Thomas Jefferson until he knows that's the one that'll take him to the Continental Divide, for example. And Cook is names half a dozen places after Lord Sandwich, the first Lord of the Admiral. So when he names something after Sandwich, like the Sandwich Islands, which are more commonly known, of course, as the Hawaiians, and properly so, you know he thinks that's important. So, so we know this is where Lewis's discovery field begins. And there's a little bit of, I think he's trying to build up his own sense of self-confidence. You know, I can do this. I'm kind of in the same stream of thought as these other great figures in history. And the truth be told, of course, is that in a way, Meriwether Lewis was very much following in the mold of Cook, because after all, Lewis is looking for the same thing on his voyage that Cook is on his third. It's the same Northwest Passage. It's taking a different form, to be sure. It's actually the third version. This is the version of the Northwest Passage invented by Alexander Mackenzie. But Cook's not out of place with kind of putting himself in this Northwest Passage saga. But he wasn't as diligent in his journal keeping as I think I say somewhere in Lewis and Clark Reframed that Lewis would have been court-martialed if he had kept as shoddy a journal for the British Admiralty. But I've come around lately to think, though, Clay, that the fall guy, the person at fault for Lewis's shortcomings, isn't Meriwether Lewis. I think he did as good a job as he could. I think the individual from history who's kind of gotten off a little bit is Thomas Jefferson. He wasn't as explicit in his instructions to Lewis as he should have been about maintaining a journal, nor did he give Lewis the kind of technical post-voyage logistical support that the Admiralty gave Cook, including time to write. I mean, Jefferson was sending Lewis to Aaron Burr's trial, getting watches repaired by some watchmaker in Philadelphia, a political appointment on the front, the chaotic frontier. I mean, a severe misjudgment on Jefferson's part. So I'm becoming, in my older age, a little more generous towards Mr. Lewis, because I don't think he was very well served by President Jefferson.
Yeah, well, now you're just talking smack if you're going to diss Jefferson here. But go ahead. Let me change the subject just slightly, because we're going to run out of time, and I'm so sorry, because there's so many more questions I have for you. But the key to your Lewis and Clark scholarship, as I understand it, is to look at the journals, now splendidly published in 13 volumes by the University of Nebraska under the talented leadership of Gary Moulton. Your approach is to look at them less as narrative than as text. And secondly, you believe that the lesser journal keepers, Ordway, Whitehouse, Patrick Gass are essential to a full understanding. And in fact, that one of the mistakes that we have made is privileging, if I can use a cultural studies term, the two captains and not triangulating what they have to say with the lesser journal keepers. And I think you have a special affection for the private Joseph Whitehouse. So talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think the important point to make about this is that whatever else might be said about their personality, their traits as human beings, Cook or Lewis as the principal writers, they are explainers, which is to say, again, to use another cultural studies term, literally they have a narrative they're trying to compose. And it's a narrative that, at least subconsciously, if not at times overtly, they're writing for an audience of a very few people. The president of the Royal Society, the head of the secretary to the Admiralty, Joseph Banks, Thomas Jefferson. And so there's a varnish laid over a lot of their narrative for reasons of patronage and reasons of state, one might call it. A private, in the case of Private Whitehouse, he has a very different agenda. First of all, he's probably been assigned this duty willingly, no doubt, and more diligent than many who had that responsibility. But predictably, I would say, I was never in the service, but when I would do public speaking, when one could speak publicly, I would ask people in the audience if anyone was an enlisted man. And I would say, do you think an enlisted man has a different perspective on a particular sequence in some military frame of reference? Is that different from an officer's? And of course, to everyone who was an enlisted man or an officer, they understand, well, it's axiomatic. Well, of course, an enlisted man has a different perspective. So if the goal is to take a binocular view of any particular voyage, you want as many different kinds of visions. It's actually more than binocular. In some of these cases, it can be multiple. I mean, you're talking about 5, 6, 7 perspectives. So different people view circumstances through different lenses. And if you only look at one stream of consciousness, you're going to get a faulty sense of reality from what everyone could see about them in real time.
And some small details in Whitehouse and in Gass and in Ordway and in Charles Floyd wind up having a pretty interesting sort of butterfly effect on our overall understanding of the experience. And furthermore, I feel that we should say at this point, and I know Linda's going to step here in a moment. We'll take questions. You'll take questions from all the people who are watching you around the country and around the world, Dave. But Native American oral traditions were routinely discounted for a very long time in the history of Lewis and Clark studies. And I'm sure that's true of Cook and other things too. And more recently, we have a much more generous view of these things. In fact, we see them as vital contributions to our understanding. And in my own work on Lewis and Clark in North Dakota, I discovered that some Canadian members of the Northwest Company and the Hudson's Bay Company were also in residence amongst the Mandan, and they speak about Lewis and Clark in ways that are really extraordinarily interesting and revealing. But just talk a minute about the changing attitude in historical circles about Native American oral contributions.
Yes. Well, it's a vital aspect of the study of both Cook and Lewis and Clark nowadays. And our friend in common, and the man we admire greatly, James Rhonda, decades ago now, put it rather pithily, that it's time to get these explorers out of their boats and to look at the experience from the shore. It's taken a long time to get to that point in the case of both studies. But there's so much more to be done. I mean, a question was asked last week. I'll just revisit it here again briefly regarding the Chinook Indians, an unrecognized tribe. I mean, just a travesty.
You mean federal legal recognition?
Yeah, federal legal recognition in the United States, and they were just indispensable to Lewis and Clark's sense of awareness and learning. I mean, even if only indirectly. For example, Lewis and Clark, I mean, until people get out to this latitude, mouth of the Columbia River is 46 north, no one knows what winter is like there until people from the Atlantic seaboard visit it in the wintertime. But when Lewis and Clark got to the mouth of the Columbia, they see how the natives are dressed. And one can see their sense of anxiety just simply drops because the astute observers, though they are, Lewis and Clark deduced the climate here in the winter must be pretty temperate based upon how the people are dressed here. So even when the people in question, the Chinooks, don't even say anything, but just model their garments, great value or great importance can be associated with that. So that story is only beginning to be told. And you and I have both argued separately that there needs to be a whole series of tribal, what I'll call trail tribal histories. And the first on that list would be the Chinook.
And you refer, of course, to Steve Evans and Alan Pinkham's book, Lewis and Clark Among the Nez Perce, which is a really extraordinary book. Let me ask one last quick related question. It's an easy question. It's a really hard answer, but I know we need at least to touch on it. I was reading your Captain Cook book, and I noticed that he was positing the Bering Strait migration and so on. And we now think, thanks to genome studies and DNA, that it's irrefutable that the Native Americans of North America originated in the, I think, Baikal Lake region of Siberia. But when you talk to Native peoples, they often say, we've always been here. It's irrefutable that we've always been here. Here's our origin story. How does a historian who's generous towards Native culture, but who also is deeply devoted to the scientific rigor, how do you handle that? Because there are truths that are scientifically verifiable, and then there's sort of a capital T truth that does not necessarily have to comport with science.
Yeah, I think historian that you've worked with, Felipe Fernandez Armesto, has answered this question directly. And part of it is the way we have framed the notion of discovery or exploration, because the premise, the conceit of historically of Cook scholarship, Lewis and Clark scholarship, is that exploration and discovery is something that white people do, or Europeans or Euro-Americans. When, as Fernandez Armesto points out, and I think Cook had a dawning awareness, but more than a dawning awareness of this, the greatest explorers and discoverers of all time were, in fact, indigenous people. I mean, Cook was just simply stunned by the magnitude of what I call the Polynesian dispersion, because they did not have the technology, the metallurgy, the sailing prowess that he had, yet they covered, what, 1/4 of the Earth's surface, hopping from island to island. And the same notion applies by analogy to North America. The greatest explorers and the greatest discoverers were Native people. We just simply have to posit that with what they had to work with. The accomplishment is all the more notable. So once we eliminate the conceit that exploration and discovery is something that only Western civilization does, this question becomes a lot easier to address. And along the lines that I've kind of highlighted here, notwithstanding the fact that the science is the science. We all, as a species, emerged from Central Africa, and the diversity of the world, the pluralism we see in the people around the world, is a function of that core species of humans spreading to all the corners of the globe. The role Cook plays, people like Cook and Lewis, is that they're the ones who delineated the extent of that dispersion. And in a sense, people like Cook, especially Lewis to a lesser extent, they are reintegrators, because it's somewhat of a trite phrase, but it's nonetheless true. we are a global village now, for better or for worse. We all know where we all came from or are presently where we have been. And that's a function of the interconnectedness that people like Cook brought to the scene. So in a sense, humanity in the course of the last 400 or 500 years has reverted to its understanding of itself.
Thank you so much, Clay, for sitting in the interviewer's chair tonight and putting Dave on the hot seat. But
I couldn't get a glove on him. I tried.
Yeah.
He was bobbing and weaving.
No, I really appreciate sort of the directions that you took the conversation down. You really moved into some new areas, and I think many of the viewers will find some fascinating new content out of this conversation. So appreciate. So we have I'm going to start off the question and answer with a question that came to us via email between last week and this week. And just to remind folks, if you do have a question you would like to ask Dave or Clay, please go ahead and put it into the YouTube chat, and I will ask it as time allows. So the first question comes from one of our viewers in New Zealand, and it is asking about the practice of distributing medals by both Captain James Cook and Lewis and Clark when they met indigenous peoples along their voyages. Cook gave out resolution and adventure medals. Lewis and Clark gave out peace medals from Thomas Jefferson. And was it typical to mark important events by issuing medals?
Do you want me to try that first, Clay? But
No,
my sound,
Go ahead.
is my sound still
good.
working good? Okay, great.
Yep,
Just
you're
wanted to
good.
make sure. Well, yes, Lewis and Clark brought what are commonly referred to as peace and friendship medals because that's what was inscribed on them. Those were the first presidential medals that had the visage of the president on them, Thomas Jefferson. But they're part of a longer tradition that Jefferson himself wrote about early on in the Washington administration. He noted that there was a long tradition of British, French, and Spanish imperial agents presenting these medals as tokens of allegiance, quasi-sovereignty, as a means of binding these various indigenous people to the colonial powers. So this tradition of medals went back at least 100 years, maybe more. In fact, there are medals of King George III that are now in museum repositories that were presented to Native leaders in the Ohio River Valley during the American Revolution, because those were an attempt to bond those tribes to the interests of Great Britain. So it's a long tradition. Cook wasn't as much into that as Lewis and Clark were, for one principal reason, and Clay can certainly elaborate on this. I think it's fair to say, Clay, now you please disagree with me if you think you need to. Lewis was more overtly an imperial agent than Cook was because he was trying to incorporate terrain into American hegemony, the Louisiana Purchase in particular. Cook would do sovereignty rights and possession ceremonies, but Lewis's goals and objectives along these lines are far more direct and recurrent than Cook's. Would you agree?
I do. I think in reading your book, I noticed that Cook did comparatively little of that, especially on the third voyage. I call these sovereignty tokens. And as you say, when Lewis Clark would give them to the Lakota or give them to the Shoshone or give them to the Chinook, it was a way of saying, you're now America's Indians. You are now tied to us. And so the natives might not have understood what the white people had in mind with this. They saw them maybe as gifts, but Lewis was clearly on an imperial mission, whether we like to talk about that or not. And these sovereignty tokens go way, way back in European history. Lewis and Clark also gave certificates of good behavior, which they filled in the blank And you just wonder how those were preserved over time amongst native peoples who essentially lived outside. They gave some gorgets, and they had some of their medals were left over from the Adams administration, and some of their medals were left over from the Washington administration. I think Oregon has one of the medals in the State Historical Society.
Possibly, yes, I think so.
Yes.
And I think Washington State University has one in their archaeological collection, although that may have been returned to the Nez Perce with whom we started this program, now that I think about it.
Great. Well, thank you both very much for the insights on gifts and medals. The next question is a little more challenging, I think. As you have acknowledged, these quote discoveries unquote by Cook and Lewis and Clark are from a colonial perspective. How much research from indigenous perspectives have you utilized in your work?
Not
This
a
is for
lot,
you,
quite
Dave.
honestly. And that's of a part with my broader approach. That work has been done. It's out there. There's an extensive post-colonial literature. I tried to bring a new perspective to the cookbook in particular, and that was to posit Cook as a polar explorer. So I don't make any pretension to. In fact, Clay's question some time ago now is indicative. I'm not suggesting the encounter is unimportant. What I am suggesting is that there's a large number of scholars who have done that work. I can't add to it or elaborate upon it. I wanted to tell a new story. And in the case of Cook, it's Cook as a polar explorer. In the case of Lewis, it's Lewis's reliance upon and the influences other explorers of British origin had on his expedition.
I'll just say this much to that. James Rhonda really pioneered this in his 1984 book, Lewis and Clark Among the Indians. And he said, and continues to resonate with me, that Lewis and Clark thought they were discovering things, but it was mutual discovery. It was working in both directions. And the natives were learning a great deal about Euro-Americans at the same time. And now, thanks to our increased cultural sensitivities, we're listening to those echoes of those oral traditions in a way that we haven't previously. Just one last thing. We keep saying cookbook, cookbook. I tried to get Dave to put the recipe for sauerkraut at the end of his book so he could call it a cookbook, because James Cook pioneered sauerkraut as a shipboard aliment, but he wouldn't do it. So
yeah, he also brewed a lot of beer, so there's that too.
yeah.
Well, thank you. The next question, and I'm not sure about the pronunciation, so bear with me. Richard Alexander Huff, Hough, supposes that Cook's death and general difficulties in his third voyage were attributable to an illness that affected his mental stability. Does that sound right to you?
No, and I've touched on this indirectly. In fact, the question of Cook's illness and frailty came up in last week's conversation. Cook did indeed get very ill. Those who were sailing with him thought deathly so, or near halfway through his second voyage. But when he returned, someone who had seen him, had been on the first voyage, said, "This man looks as healthy and as spry as he ever did." But the proof is in the pudding, as trite as that saying is, because there's no tangible evidence of a lack of vigor by Cook during the third voyage to give evidence to the fact that he was out of sorts or not as ambitious as ever. And in fact, my way of telling that story is his exploration of Norton Sound. Not the best known one in the larger world of Cook scholarship. Trust me, Norton Sound is as much of a Cook backwater as there is, even if it is on the way to the Northwest Passage. His crew was exhausted. They wanted nothing to do it. But going back to Stalen's map, Cook wasn't sure that somehow he had missed the eastern side of this Alaska island. So he spent weeks exploring Norton Sound just to make sure that he somehow hadn't missed an opening to the northeast that would take him over the top of North America. And he sailed longer, 15 degrees of longitude wide along the Arctic ice edge. He never sailed along the Antarctic ice edge for as long a linear a path on his second voyage as he did on the third. So J.C. Beaglehole, the editor of Cook's journals, the equivalent of Gary Moulton's, but was well known in Lewis and Clark world, ceded in his introduction, in his annotation to the Cook journals, by way of a rhetorical question, because he didn't spend time in Samoa and Fiji, where Midshipman Gilbert wanted to go, Clay, who bemoans the fact that they're going to sail to the part of the world that's the whole point of the voyage. So he whines and complains about that. Beaglehole picks up on these strange, stray whining by midshipmen, Trevenant occasionally, Gilbert, and he developed this whole hypothesis that it wasn't the same Cook. And that's another thing I tried to demolish in that book, because it's commonly said that people who had been with Cook's earlier voyages saw a change in the man. But when you actually look at the roster of who's sailing with Cook, there's like 12 people who had been on both voyages with Cook. There wasn't a great number of people who thought this was a different Cook. So Beaglehole asked this rhetorical question, picking up on these whining midshipmen, and conflates, by way of a rhetorical question, has Cook lost his mojo? And the regional historians apply the same thing on the Northwest Cook about not looking for Fuca Strait or the Columbia River. So Huff and Beaglehole, I dare say they're all wrong. There's no physical and tangible evidence that Cook was anything as diligent. He was as diligent on his third voyage as he was at any time on his first two. He just happened to get killed on the third voyage, which, as I said last week, and I recounted chapter and verse, somewhat to the annoyance of my editors up in Vancouver, he could have been killed upwards of a dozen times during the course of the three voyages. His luck finally ran out at Kealakekua Bay, but that circumstance has entirely flavored and created a jaundiced view of Cook's third and final voyage.
I don't want to interrupt that diatribe, but my goodness, but demolish, really, that's a pretty strong word for a historian. But nevertheless, I do find it paradoxical, and I wish we could take a break and spend a couple of more hours at this, because you're so quick in River of Promise to say that Lewis had run out of his mojo, that Lewis was having a slow motion nervous breakdown on the return voyage, and you're so quick to defend Captain Cook as still having it, even though there are signs of impatience. All the pilfering. In your book, you talk about how he really lost his equanimity over pilfering and petty theft. And so I see some of the same strain of the long journey in both. We don't have time to go into that in detail, but we'll have that for another conversation. So Linda.
All right, thank you very much. The next question, some stories say that the Corps of Discovery was unable to explore Mount Coffin near what is now Longview, as they were pelted with rocks by the Chinooks. Is there any primary source evidence of this?
Boy, I don't recall. Lewis and Clark had some at times contentious encounters along that stretch, but I can't directly recollect from the journals of them being pelted by rocks. So I'm going to have to be an agnostic on that particular point.
There was lots of jeering, and I think there was some kicking of rocks off the cliff, but I don't think there was any pelting.
Okay, great, thank you. Well, those are all the questions we've received so far. Certainly, if anybody still has something they'd like to ask, put it into the chat. I have a couple of questions that I'm going to pose to Dave, and one of them is kind of a repeat of what we had asked last week. where I had not allowed Dave to prepare, but now he's better prepared to answer the question of where, if someone is starting off their exploration of Pacific Northwest explorers, what kinds of resources would you recommend to them?
Right. Thank you for re-asking. There was nothing wrong with my question last week, but I think I got too particular too soon, especially since one of the sources I cited was Clay's own book, The Character of Meriwether Lewis. But I think for someone who's completely new to this subject, I mean, there are dense literatures around Lewis and Clark and Captain Cook. In fact, it's truly amazing that these presses decided to publish 2 more books, namely mine, on these subjects. But I think the single best 2 sources or scholars to start with for the broadest possible context for exploration. And I started to do that earlier with my riff on Felipe Fernando's Armesto that got interrupted by the unfortunate alert message. His book Pathfinders talks about exploration, not from 30,000 feet, but the history of exploration from 100,000 feet. The great divergence from Africa, and as I was saying when we were interrupted, the great convergence in modern time. And the point I was about to build up to is that we have humanity's sense of itself has reverted to a point in time that goes back hundreds of thousands of years to when we all lived in Africa. And that's kind of Pathfinders by Felipe Fernandez Armesto. The more particular North American overview would be William Getzmann's New Lands and New Men. That was the 3rd of his trilogy. He had written Army Exploration in the West, and he had done a book about I'm sorry, I've lost track of his second great book. But New Lands, New Men, published in the early 1980s, is a great overview of Enlightenment era exploration, kind of from the era of Cook through Wilkes and Fremont, but the cultural ramifications of exploration, not just kind of the grittiness of what it was like being at sea or being on the trail. And then there's one other scholar in terms of global understanding, and that would be Glenn Williams, a tremendous scholar, comprehensive understanding of exploration of all its complexity. So if someone wants to take the biggest possible point of view on exploration history, Williams, Getzmann, Fernandez, Armesto are the place to start, although there are many others.
Well, thank
Do
you.
you want to answer that question, Clay?
No, I agree with you entirely.
When you're doing your research and learning about all these different trips that these explorers have taken, how much traveling have you done to kind of not recreate the journeys, but kind of follow in the footsteps of the explorers?
That's a great question. Very fair one. And ultimately probably not very satisfying to many who are tuning in, because there are scholars who do this. Tony Horowitz famously, in the case of Cook, Clay in the case of Lewis and Clark. Clay's been over the entire Lewis and Clark trail. I've been over much of it, so I'll cut myself a little slack on Lewis and Clark. But I'm what, in regard to Cook, can only be said to be an armchair historian. Francis Parkman, in his famous 19th century histories, derided people like me who sit in their closets and their libraries and their armchairs, and they read journals, and they conceive that they are in a position to explain these events to other people. And Parkman's great quote was, which I fully subscribe to, and so, which is namely that for the historian to do his or her job appropriately, you have to go to the spot where the story that you are recounting played out. I make no pretense to be a global traveler. But Clay said something earlier that's exculpatory. And this has got me into trouble with some Lewis and Clark people along the trail. And that is this. And this is where Parkman himself, I dare say, maybe not entirely correct. Exploration is, in fact, an outdoor experiential phenomenon. One step or one row of the oar or one leg of a tack at sea after another. But in a fundamental level, exploration is literature. After all, unless you wrote your journal and published an account of your voyage, it was as if the venture had never happened. So fundamentally then, in my own defense, just sitting in a library and in my easy chair with a text is as good a way to understand that aspect of exploration history as any other part. Clay, get that tongue out of your cheek.
I'm not going to refute that, although, really, but I'll say this. Theodore Roosevelt explored the River of Doubt in South America in 1914, the last uncharted river in South America in the Amazon basin. He came back, he lost 54 pounds, a quarter of his body mass. When he began to publish his results, the British Royal Geographic Society said, no way, he's lying, he's exaggerating, didn't happen, there is no such river. We really need to question this. He got himself invited over to London to give a lecture. He gave the lecture and he refuted them, and they had to eat crow. Armchair historians are notoriously skeptical of field work, and they make a lot of very serious prejudicial errors. Richard Francis Burton suffered from that in his search for the Nile. Cook suffered from that in his search for the Northwest Passage. And Theodore Roosevelt suffered grievously from that with these snobs. I don't mean you, Dave, who sit in their chairs smoking their pipe and they think they know more about Africa than somebody who traipsed all across it in search of the source of the Nile. So I'm with Parkman, and I think my goal is to get you out onto the trail, is to get you into a tent, is to make you eat some grub.
So Linda, last week you promised there would be fireworks at this week's presentation. So I think Clay and I have lived up to that charge.
Some metaphorical fireworks, absolutely. Well, I thank both of you very, very much for your willingness to sit here with each other and talk about these great explorers and share your insights and perspectives with our audience.
We thank you.
Certainly. I want to thank the audience as well for attending tonight's event. And the information for ordering the books will be posted on the screen momentarily. And we encourage you, local bookstores, where possible and safe to do so. We hope that you really enjoyed this conversation, and we look forward to seeing you at a future event. Good night and good reading.